feel that their government is not taking their viewpoint seriously enough. But I do not necessarily think that European civilization itself will collapse. I think that in 50 or 100 years from now, Europe will be different. But as I said, we've always been changing. The Europe from the medieval era, from say the 1400s, is not the same Europe of the 1800s, and it's not in the Europe of the 1800s. It's not the same Europe as today. We're always going to be changing, so we can probably say that the cultural landscape of Europe will probably fall at some point in our lifetimes. I also believe that it will probably be replaced by something else. Perhaps it will be better, perhaps not. But then once another 50 or 100 years ago elapses, whatever replaces us right immediately afterwards will also be drastically different. Sorry, and if you guys are wondering, one of the reasons why the voice might sound a little bizarre is because I actually do maybe coming on from a bit of a cold right now, so just please keep that in mind while I keep talking. So this is a bit more of a serious question here. He's asking me, question number 10. That the Nuremberg trials in 1945 to 1946 perpetuated what they supposedly tried to eliminate. At first I didn't understand that question, so I actually asked him to clarify a little bit. He meant to ask me whether or not the Allies and Soviets were being hypocrites and claiming that they were fighting for human rights while they themselves were doing a lot of the same things that they accused the Germans and the Japanese of doing. I believe that there's definitely a fair point here because as I'm certain, for example, that students who study Soviet history know, there was nothing that was remotely better about the Soviet government versus the Nazis in terms of how they treated their population. Even before the Second World War broke out, Stalin, he had been responsible for the Holodomor, which according to historians killed anywhere between 5 to perhaps over 10 million people. The Kazakh famine, which may have wiped out as many as 42% of the Kazakh population, who had themselves survived the earlier famine under Lenin, which had also killed around a quarter of their inhabitants. Between 1936 to 1938, Stalin's Great Terror resulted in the documented execution of at least 681,692 people, even though a lot of historians believe that the real numbers could be anywhere between 1,200,000 or perhaps even as high as 2 million. The later one, I think, coming from the historian Rupert Butler. And that doesn't even include the 116,000 people who were documented to have died in gulags as a result of these purges. And according, as said, just as the number of official executions is believed to be drastically downplayed in the modern archives, which were only started to open in 2013. The historians have suggested that anywhere between 1 million to perhaps over 9 million people who were arrested between this 2-year period also died in political prison camps throughout the Soviet Union. That in itself, I think, quite literally rivals the worst atrocities that the Germans were accused of doing during the war years. And keep in mind, this is not even happening at a time when the Soviet Union was being invaded. This was happening during peacetime conditions when, as far as Stalin was concerned, Hitler was a reluctant but otherwise fairly reliable ally to have with. He had no reason to believe that the Germans were going to turn around on him. And if anything, he probably even thought that the British or the Americans, who had already previously fought his country a generation earlier, would have been a much more likely military opponent to face off. And then you have to keep in mind too that after the war concluded, a lot of people were deported back to the Soviet Union against their own will, according to folks such as Ian Baruma's year zero, it was not uncommon for American and British guards to bayonet returning repatriated refugees who, for some reason, tried to put up any resistance. In the Bladeberg repatriations, Operation Keelhaul, etc., as many as 400,000 to 500,000 people, according to an KVD officer who had interviewed Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the 1970s, were directly executed. And these do not include those who perhaps died in the gulags or other political prison camps after being forcibly returned. These are the kinds of crimes that a lot of defendants in Nuremberg were tried over. They were told that even if they themselves did not believe the orders given to them, that they had an obligation to essentially risk their own lives to fight against the government for giving such an unlawful order. And yet, here the Americans and the British were often teary-eyed themselves at the idea that they were being forced to help Stalin and Tito and their allies in dispatching millions of refugees who had initially found themselves in Western Europe at the end of the war, but who were declared by late future Prime Minister Anthony Eden to not be worthy of any type of refuge. And then, of course, during the actual war itself, the Soviet Union, they wreaked a lot of havoc on the civilian population. The archives regarding the NKVD's role in the war are not even scheduled to be open until, I believe, at the earliest year 2050. And quite unsurprisingly, this is because they obviously did not want their countrymen in particular to know the extent of their own war crimes. But according to the historian Sean McMeekin, who wrote a book called Stalin's War, which I got around to reading fairly recently, he believed that essentially that the Soviets were facing far worse towards the civilian population than the Germans were. And this is something that I feel is corroborated by people that I have spoken to over the years who lived under both systems. For example, Poles and Ukrainians who experienced life under Hitler and then life under Stalin. They more often than not would unhesitatingly say that the Germans were the better of the two occupiers. Surviving letters from that period even say that Russian citizens who had the least reason to fear Stalin oftentimes still spoke about fearing the NKVD and the Red Army more than the war-matching Gestapo. Mark Solonin, a Russian Jew who one of my viewers brought up in a later question, he once suggested that during this period that Hitler did not approach the Stalinist level, in its words, by 2 orders of magnitude. According to an estimated report of his, some 5 to 6 million Eastern Europeans were killed directly as a result of the German invasion. For example, people who were executed or perhaps died in German concentration camps. But then he also says that during that same time period, some 6 to 9 million Eastern European civilians were also executed or died in camps being operated by the Soviet government. And it must also be pointed out that while a lot of people, they focus oftentimes on the crimes committed by the Soviets in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, during the final months of the war, in particular, the Soviets also waged their own campaigns in Asia. Manchuria and modern-day North Korea were both invaded by the Soviets. The city of Mukden in particular was said to have been annihilated in a manner that later survivors who had previously experienced the horrors of Nanking said that they felt more in fear of their lives by what the Soviets had done during August and September of 1945 than what had happened to them in 1937. And yet, a lot of Japanese were tried for their role in Nanking, including those who were apparently not thrilled about who were apparently against what had happened, but who were nonetheless held responsible simply because of their ranking. And yet, apparently Soviet officers had formally subjected Mukden to 3 days of pillage. Nothing came of that. Other cities, such as Andong, on the modern border of Manchuria and Korea, and even the modern North Korean capital Pyongyang were also said to have been similarly pillaged, and nothing came of that. And I hardly need to explain it because the Soviets, they simply won the war. And to be fair, the Soviets themselves were not the only war criminals during this period. Of course, the Axis themselves had also done their own fair share of human atrocities, and the Americans and the British did as well. In regards to the latter group, we are starting to find out that the killing of surrounding Germans was far more common than previously thought. Historians such as Anthony Beaver have been known to write books about these types of killing sprees, such as his gory description of some 267 Germans who were reportedly killed in and immediately around Nijmegen Bridge during Operation Market Garden, many of whom were actually executed after they had already tried to surrender. And then, of course, as I said, the British and Americans were heavily involved in the mass repatriation of millions of Soviet refugees that was, quite frankly, largely denied until after the Cold War, when modern historians began to uncover the mass graves along Slovenia and Eastern Germany, and they they essentially saw the skeletal remains of those who were presumably executed after they had initially fled from the Soviet groups. I think that in Slovenia alone, more than 100,000 political victims have been recovered, and according to those who've been exhuming these graves in recent years, the vast majority of them, unsurprisingly, have yet to be found. So that's why the events that occurred there right after the Second World War have been compared to the later, better-known killing fields of Cambodia. Both of them were equally horrific, but Pol Pot being one of the few communist leaders to ever be overthrown and captured alive, we end up knowing more about him just because of his circumstances, and not because what he did was somehow less ruthless, but just simply because he happened to be one of the few that was ultimately made accountable for his own actions. The British and Americans leaders who knew what was happening when they were doing these deportations, they were never overthrown by any disgruntled victims of these political repercussions. So they didn't have to explain their situation, and the same applied to Stalin and Tito. They lived on for many more years. They died in office, and because they never lost the war, they were able to essentially rewrite their own history to their own liking. And then, of course, we have a lot of prisoners who were brought to Nuremberg, and they were more or less tortured into making certain confessions. That's not to say that all the confessions are false. In fact, I would probably say that a lot of them, perhaps even most of these confessions, are probably based on real accounts. But the point still is that regardless of what later history books said, a lot of the confessions were still obtained under fairly questionable circumstances. Rudolf Hess just happens to be the most notable instance from all the accounts I've read. Apparently, the group of British officers under the command of Bernard Clark had even tortured his barely 16-year-old son before his mother in order to get her to tell him where Hess was hiding, because as certain people who know about this period know, the former Auschwitz commander had gone into hiding. It was apparent, I think, as far as I understand, he was posing as a regular Polish farmer. And even after Hess was arrested, from what I understand, he was severely beaten, and one detail of his that no doubt was false was the number of people he claimed had died. Modern historians, they now estimate that the number of people who died at Auschwitz was closer to 1 million. Some even say it could be as low as several 100,000. But in the document he had to sign in English, which was a language he did not understand himself, the number was around 4 million. So we can say later on that the Soviets inflated the numbers and that this was never a number that was promoted in the West, but the fact still is that the British were the ones who actually made Hess sign a document claiming this number as an official fact. And even if Hess was guilty, regardless of whether it was 1 million or 4 million, the fact still is that out of not resorting ourselves to Stalinist type of terror, I don't think that he should have been tortured into making confession. I think that if they had the evidence, they should have done what we do in any other regular trial and just look for the physical remains or eyewitness testimony, and then see from there how the evidence would weigh up against him. And I must also point out before I move on, because I said I don't want to spend too much time on one question, Hess was not the only person who was tortured. I believe that according to Ian Baruma's Year Zero, was at Stuttgart alone, at least 137 defendants reported had their testicles crushed. And then there's also another infamous location known as the London Cage, where prisoners were apparently tortured with electrical devices, or they would be made to stand at attention without sleep for days on end until their mental resistance broke down, so to speak, and then they would make the confessions. I think that's. I think it's very comparable to anything that Hitler or Stalin would have been accused of doing. We look at the Stalinist trials of the 1930s, and we in the West say, well, these people were tortured into making these confessions, so what credibility do they have? More recently, Otto Warren, the leader of North Korea, he was undoubtedly pressured into making the confessions that he made on North Korean television before his own sentencing to 15 years imprisonment. We dismiss these accusations as questionable because we tell ourselves that almost anybody can break down under pressure when they endure enough stress. But for some reason, the same rule doesn't apply in regards to Nuremberg. But as I said, I'm not saying that the defendants were innocent. I think that to some extent or another, most of them probably did do at least some of the things they were accused of doing. But I also understand that a lot of these crimes, perhaps even if they took place, they could have just easily been done by other parties. For instance, the Soviets had tried to find ways of linking the Katyn Forest massacre with the Germans. And apparently they had done the same thing with Kuropatki in Belarus and Bukivnia in Ukraine, only for this narrative to later fall apart in later decades when it was found from surviving eyewitnesses that it was actually the NKVD that had carried out these massacres. But just because the Soviets and perhaps even the Allies did some things doesn't necessarily exonerate the Germans and their allies of any wrongdoing. It just means that perhaps that a lot of what they're accused of could just easily have been done by the victors. Because after all, it's not like any of them were ever put on trial at the end of the war. Okay, so question number 11. This is actually kind of interesting. Operation Barbarossa, was it a preemptive strike? So the Germans, I do not believe, well, let's put it this way, the Germans, this idea that Hitler from the outset had always intended to invade the Soviet Union is quite largely unprovable. If anything, there's more evidence to suggest that Stalin would have wanted to invade Germany, but even that is kind of up in the air right now. During the First World War, the Germans, they had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Lenin, I think it was on March 3rd, 1918. And so some 750,000 to 1 million Germans who have been fighting on the Eastern Front, alongside countless numbers of Austrian troops, more or less left their borders undefended in order to fight the war on the Western Front. And then after Lenin recuperated from the initial revolutions, he essentially collaborated with Ernst Toller in Germany that would drive Germany into some sort of a civil war situation. And even though his the uprising didn't become more widespread until the final days of the war, the earlier factory strikes that had been initiated by communist and socialist movements in Germany, no doubt, impacted the situation on the Western Front and probably brought the war to an end much earlier than would have otherwise been the case. But this was not being done because Lenin had wanted to see Germany peacefully defeated and perhaps bring an end to a conflict. What his ultimate goal was to essentially have his newly built Red Army and sweep across Europe and perhaps develop a communist stronghold from Moscow all the way up to London at some later point. He invaded Ukraine, and after Joseph Pilsudski of Poland tried to essentially form up a union to counter the Soviet threat. Poland itself was invaded, and had it not been for the close call defeat of Mikhail Tukhachevsky at Warsaw in August 1920, it's quite likely that the Soviets would have just kept pushing on into Germany. After all, Hungary itself eventually fell into a communist uprising, and its leader, Dalakun, for just under 2 months, was able to essentially turn Hungary into a communist state that was loyal to the Soviet Union. So when Stalin later came to power, no doubt he himself had the same ambitions, because he had been originally assigned with the invasion of Italy should the Polish invasion had become a Red Army success. And with Hitler, he probably saw him as a man who, while having views that are far more reactionary in his own, at least in theory, he probably still saw him as someone who's at least somewhat more socialist-minded, and so he would have probably seen him as a far better ally to have than, say, the Americans and the British. And that's, and then you have to understand too that during the 1930s, the Germans, they had provided the Soviets with some submarine technology. This was partially in gratitude to the 1922 Treaty of Rapallo, which the Germans and Lenin had later signed, because the former, after the Treaty of Versailles, were told that they could not essentially test any weapons of their own within German territory, but a loophole had allowed them to do so in a foreign country. And so the Germans began improving their own military arsenal within Soviet borders in exchange for monetary fees. And then later on, once their relations improved, the Germans, they essentially sent they exchanged scientists from the two countries, and in the Soviet Empire they got what was called a Stalinic submarine. that essentially was a submarine class that was largely inspired by provisions handed to them over from Berlin. And suffice to say that when a war came in 1941, this would make the Soviet naval fleet far stronger than it had otherwise would have been. So I failed to see what exactly kind of advantage Hitler would have had if he had known that he was going to be fighting against the same enemy for whom he was sending out supplies to only a few years earlier. But then also you have to understand that Stalin himself likely felt much more paranoid about another invasion from Churchill or even Roosevelt and Hitler prior to Operation Barbarossa. As a matter of fact, it's now known that the Soviet Union had even gotten some rubber from as far away as India and provided the Germans with these resources along with meadow and even some tanks and trucks that were later used for the invasion of France. According to various history books, including Stalin's War by Sean McMeekin, the Soviet premier had believed that if another repeat of 1914 took place, Hitler would be finding himself in a bogged down war between the United Kingdom and France, and inevitably the former would end up losing, and then Stalin would be able to use this as an excuse to intervene on behalf of Hitler and essentially gain Germany while also gain annexation of Germany while also claiming that he was doing this some sort of a favor. Because said Stalin apparently there's even document out there talked about the likelihood that the two countries would just bleed themselves out, and he had every reason to believe that Hitler stood no chance of winning in that type of conflict, because even when population differences and modern technology are accounted for, the Germans actually invaded France in 1940 with less tons of military equipment than the German army from 1914. And not only that, but the British and French, they had far more time to prepare the defenses than the Kaiser's armies had only 26 years earlier. As a matter of fact, Hitler, when he first heard of the reports that his army was actually winning, he was so confused that he even thought that perhaps this was some sort of a trap, and that may have actually allowed a lot of British and French to escape from Dunkirk and make their way across the English Channel. Whether or not this was an intentional act by the British, perhaps to deny Stalin his ideal scenario, that we cannot know. But what we do know is that even though he congratulated Hitler on his success after the surrender of the French army, in his private life, apparently his officials reportedly witnessed Stalin angrily screaming about the Allied loss and saying, why did they allow Hitler to thrash them? And I suppose I kind of understand his frustrations if you were somebody who was looking at the situation in 1914 and realizing that even with your provisions, your so-called ally was no better off than his predecessor and somehow beating all the odds. So from Stalin's point of view, the Germans taking France meant that he also would not have an excuse to invade Germany, right? Because his intention was after a couple of years of fighting, the Germans would our army would just break down, and then he would be forced, so to speak, to send his own army and intervene. But that never happened because the British ultimately denied that scenario to him. And then even more interestingly is that in 1940, when Vyacheslav Molotov visited Berlin to speak with the Russian von Ribbentrop, the British, they apparently got news of this planned meeting beforehand, and one night, while the negotiations were taking place, they proceeded to launch a massive aerial bombardment just as a means of convincing the ambassador that the Germans were not doing as well as they had initially claimed that they were. But during that meeting, it was later reported that Ribbentrop had suggested that the Soviets should consider a potential invasion of India. And even though the reasons behind this meeting are not exactly clear, the most likely explanation that I can think about at this time is because the Germans were hoping that if Soviets were occupied invading another foreign country, that they could perhaps one day launch a seaboard invasion across the English Channel and not have to worry about a repeat of 1918 when the Red Army began threatening their eastern wars. And of course, by this time, the Soviets, they were becoming increasingly distrustful of the Germans, so they in turn were also somewhat unwilling to turn their armies away from central Poland, and so the planned invasion of India as well as the planned invasion of the United Kingdom never took place. But then there's also other factors to consider. Until 1941, the Soviets, they were not only neutral with the Germans, they were also allied with them. Aside from the military provisions that Stalin had handed to them, they had also taken part in some military operations directly that later Chrysler revealed. For example, the German auxiliary cruiser Comet was able to make its way across the Arctic Ocean with the help of two Soviet ships, and because of the cooperation between the two countries, the German cruiser was able to get into the Pacific Ocean and quickly destroy 7 British warships on the Pacific front. And then there was also a German submarine base that was planted in Bassin-Nord, just northwest of Murmansk. They were brought there because that way they would be able to evade the British Navy far more efficiently. So they would essentially raid the British, and then they would make their way back into Soviet territory where they were essentially untouchable, because even though Stalin had taken a bigger chunk of Polish territory than the Germans had during the 1939 invasion of Poland, the British, they were very reluctant to declare war against the Soviet dictator, because they knew that if they did so, then he would have every excuse to launch an invasion of his own, and that was a scenario that the British at that time were not willing to take while Hitler was still a viewable threat. So I plan on getting more into that later on, but I hope that I got that covered, because I want to be able to get on to move on and perhaps answer some questions from other users. Oh, actually, hang on. Okay, you still have a couple more questions. I'll just share. These are not going to be too hard to go through, so I'll just quickly answer them one at a time here. Debt by credit cards. Does the minimum payment actually pay back the amount in a reasonable time, or can it lead to debts going on for years? I'm not exactly certain what the question is supposed to mean, or does the amount pay back in I'll try to do my user, the person who asked me this question later on, they can help clarify, because I'm not exactly certain what he means by that. But I suppose perhaps what he is asking is whether or not interest rates and payback periods are too long, and I think that largely depends. As I said, I don't necessarily think that every debt is equal. I believe that some debt can be more beneficial than others. going into debt because you're trying to build a factory that can later produce resources that you can probably afford to wait longer to pay back. Debt that's more aesthetically pleasing, such as buying furniture that might help the furniture company, but it's not exactly producing in the same manner, so to speak. So in that case, I could definitely understand why that kind of debt would be worse. And then I believe that tuition debt, that's not exactly good debt to be in, because contrary to popular belief, having a university degree itself is not what creates wealth. It's the productivity of a country's society that makes it. So having people going into your classroom taking a piece of paper that it's not going to produce anything, so to speak. And so that's why I can understand why critics who are against loan forgiveness, but on the other hand are quick to defend the use of industrial buildings, I could understand why they regard the latter to be somewhat justifiable, but not the former, because, as I said, in regards to the former, it's only a theoretical wealth creation, but it's not a practical one in the same way that the actual employment is. He's asking, question number 13. Winston Spencer Churchill, what was his relationship